Good morning, everyone. I have to lower this. Not that tall. You're loading it? Okay. I'd like to call up our panelists while we wait. Still don't see it on that screen. There we go. Yay! Good morning, everybody. My name is Ebony Dasheill-Aje, and I'm Executive Director and Head of Patient-Centered Outcome Science at BioMarin. And it's my pleasure to moderate this amazing session today, where we're going to be discussing how we're going to be using patient experience data to inform value assessment for access decision-making. Here's a disclaimer for everyone to be covered from a compliance perspective. And rather than read everyone's bios, I'll invite our speakers to briefly introduce themselves in order on the table with name and affiliation.
Hi, everyone. Pleasure to be here. My name is Jessica Abel, and I am the Director of PED Policy and Best Practices at AbbVie.
Iyar Mazar, Director of Patient-Centered Outcomes Assessment at Pfizer.
Hi, good morning. Leah Howard, the President and CEO of the National Psoriasis Foundation.
I'm Dana McCormick, Senior Director, Practice Strategy and Innovation for the Academy of Managed Care Pharmacy.
Thank you all. Here's how we're going to spend our time together today. I'll take a couple more minutes to set the landscape and frame our session, and then we'll have three presenters who will share remarks over around 30 minutes. We're going to have a moderated panel discussion, and then we're going to open it up with audience Q&A. And our objectives today are to review HTA archetypes and the varying global requirements for patient experience data, examine U.S. payer awareness and readiness, learn from real-world patient advocacy engagement with ICER and payers, and identify opportunities, challenges, and best practices for sponsors and other folks to generate patient experience data to support value demonstration. And one quick terminology point I want to make, we recognize that there are varying definitions out there, aka EMA, for patient experience data. But today we're going to ground our discussion in the FDA's definition of patient experience data, which encompasses clinical outcome assessments, patient preference information, and also both qualitative and quantitative evidence. All right, you may ask, when do we start discussing payer evidence at the annual meeting? Right? Today. We're starting today, y'all. We're starting today. We are making progress. Yes. Yes, thank you, CPATH, for opening up this dialogue. I think it's many years coming where we've been wondering, okay, where is that portion of this discussion? So now we are opening it up. And, you know, while it's a relatively new topic for this forum, it's timely and relevant because it sits at the critical intersection of clinical development, regulatory approval, and real-world access, where the evidence that we generate has to be generated for multiple decision makers and stakeholders who have different evidentiary standards as well as different expectations. And in fact, over the past decade, we've seen meaningful evolution on the regulatory side on how patient experience data is valued across the healthcare ecosystem. And we know that it's gone beyond regulatory standards. We know there are other stakeholders who have demonstrated that there's value in this evidence for their decision making as well. But we know that HTA and payer communities, they're at varying levels of stages of readiness to systematically integrate this evidence into their decision making. So we hope that today's session will give us concrete insights into where we are, where we're going, and how stakeholders can work together to generate patient experience data and determine how to meaningfully incorporate it so that it informs access decisions. And with that, we're going to begin our presentations. So I'm going to hand it over to Jessica to begin.
All right. Thank you so much, Ebony, and it's my pleasure to kick off our session today and to really provide an overview of the landscape as it relates to HTA expectations for PED and try and endeavor to answer the question, does one size fit all? So I know Ebony gave a wonderful brief overview of patient experience data and what we mean by that in her introductory remarks, but I feel like we've used the term a lot, and it's really important to begin by sort of just grounding us all in a foundational understanding a little bit deeper on what we mean when we say PED. So there's increasing focus on PED in recent years has led to two similar, but I would argue slightly different definitions of patient experience data from both the US and the EU. And given the draft nature of EMA's reflection paper that came out this past September, where we saw that latest definition of PED, as Ebony said, we're really going to focus on the US definition. And that was defined in the 21st Century Cures Act as data that are collected by any persons intended to provide information about a patient's experiences with a disease or condition, and it really includes information on symptoms and natural history of their condition, impact of their disease and conditioning on functioning and quality of life, experiences with treatments, input on outcomes that matter, preferences for outcomes and treatments, and really the relative importance of any issues that are defined by patients. And PED, as Ebony said, is captured through both qualitative and quantitative sources of evidence. And it's important that we think about integrating it throughout medical product development to ensure that we're considering patients' perspectives and their experiences living with a particular condition that will really help us inform more patient-centric decision-making across our stakeholders. So grounding ourselves in that definition becomes even more important when we consider the broader context beyond just regulatory agencies when they're talking about PED and how HTA bodies are actually talking about PED. And this sort of word cloud really shows the various terms used in HTA guidances and assessment reports to describe PED. And you see a lot of focus on PROs and health-related quality of life. All of this really does emphasize this need for harmonization around what we're talking about when we say PED. So there's a lot of work to be done. But again, it's really helpful that we're all kind of speaking the same language when we think about PED. So hopefully we all have that common understanding now of what we mean. And before we jump into considering the use of PED by HTA agencies, it's really important to understand the various HTA archetypes that currently exist and how they evaluate clinical, economic, and patient-focused evidence to inform policy decisions on coverage, pricing, and reimbursement for new health technologies. So there's two main global HTA archetypes, and the US is what we call a third emerging archetype. And there are key differences in how evidence is weighed and assessed within each of these. In CA markets, of which Germany is the primary one, the clinical benefit is really the primary focus in evaluating changes in patient-relevant endpoints to really comprehensively assess how a patient feels, functions, or survives. And key components include mortality, morbidity, generic and disease-specific quality of life, as well as safety and tolerability. When you think about that second bucket in what we call comparative effectiveness markets, plus those that consider economic evidence in their decision making, like the UK, France, Canada, and others, quality adjusted life years or QALYs, as well as incremental cost effectiveness ratios or ICERs are really central to how they assess economic value of health interventions to inform their reimbursement and pricing decisions. And their main focus is really on value for money. With a particular call out to France, who also places added emphasis on health-related quality of life in its assessments. And in the US, there is no single national HTA body, and we see a combination of CA and CA plus economic evidence used in its HTA and value assessments. And these are carried out by a variety of public and private organizations and stakeholders. So across these archetypes, we really see a varying emphasis on clinical and economic outcomes that really help to inform decision-making for these stakeholders. And so our ultimate question is, do HTA agencies actually value PED as central to decision-making? And unfortunately, I don't have a clear-cut answer on that, but only to say that the extent which HTA agencies value PED really varies markedly across these different archetypes, from mandated and central to valued in some cases and emerging and uncertain in others. So again, starting with CA in Germany, PED and quality of life data are required and central to assessments. And they have strict standards for COA-based endpoints, for clinical assessments, and benefit ratings. In CA plus economic evaluation markets, PED is highly valued in most cases, but standards and requirements do vary by country. So we think about the UK, PED is integrated into their cost effectiveness evaluations, with quality of life utilities directly informing their economic evaluations. In France, PED enhances clinical added value and is highly valued, especially as it relates to quality of life and PRO impacts. And while it's not mandatory, the absence of PED can actually impact a value score. And again, there are strict standards for COA-based endpoints. In Canada, it's a bit of a different scenario. PED is looked at as optional and really considered on a more case-by-case basis, with the level of evidence and impact dependent on the individual assessments. And then finally, in the US, which Iyar will talk in greater detail about in her presentation, we see that stakeholders have this increasing interest in PED, but there's really limited familiarity and a lack of standardized expectations that are limiting its use in their decision making. So across these different archetypes, we have seen an increase in PED used in HTA decision making, with the number of non-mandatory COAs included in health technology appraisals for GBA, NICE, and HOS increasing around 20% over a 10-year period. And non-mandatory COAs were defined here as those that are not required for regulatory approval or market access. And this positive trend in the use of these types of data really indicates an increasing recognition of the added value of PED beyond that we would ordinarily see supporting approval or access decision making. And so to ensure that we're generating the right PED evidence to optimize decision-making, it's important that we design our global PED strategies and evidence generation plans, starting with the end in mind, and really considering all drug development hurdles across the development life cycle in a comprehensive way that really supports optimal approval, quality access, and maximum adoption. So to enhance PED strategies and support effective evidence generation for access, there are really three key areas of focus that we can be considering. The first is comprehensive PED strategies, wherein your concepts, measures, and endpoints are aligned with both regulatory and access needs and are grounded in what's important to the target patient population. And collection of data on burden, unmet needs, and patient preferences should also be considered to complement any COA data that you're generating from your clinical trials. The second area of focus is trial design, and really ensuring we have high-quality data for our HTA-relevant endpoints with minimal missing data and appropriate inclusion in your testing hierarchy. And the value of conducting in-trial interviews should also be considered as a way to obtain information to really help support endpoint interpretation or address any trial-specific challenges, particularly when we're considering open-label studies. And the final area of focus here relates to our sponsor submissions. And this is really our opportunity to do more with the data we have and really maximize the use of our available PED, including both our qualitative and our quantitative evidence, to really help strengthen our submissions. And along the way, ensuring that we are aligned with agency expectations and existing guidances, and bringing our local affiliates along too, and making sure that they really understand the value of comprehensively integrating PED into these types of submissions. And the last point is really looking at executive summaries as our opportunity to further highlight supportive PED that's been included in that submission, and perhaps even serve as a roadmap for reviewers to really help them in the application of PED for their decision making. So Unfortunately, as I get to my last slide and answer that initial question, when all is said and done, there is no one-size-fits-all approach to PED for access, as much as we would like there to be. And there's a lot of variability in evidentiary standards by archetype and even by country within each archetype. So there is this overall need, as I said earlier, for global harmonization on terminology, but also on evidentiary standards for PED, to really help us facilitate effective evidence generation and elevate patient experience data for more informed decision-making from the access perspective. And finally, when we think about PED strategies, really designing those through a global lens, balancing the needs of regulatory and access stakeholders to really ensure that we have the right evidence available and integrated early and throughout our development programs to inform patient-focused decision-making across all of our stakeholders. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to Iyar.
Thank you, Jessica. As Jessica said, I'll be touching on U.S. payers and patient experience data as part of this panel. I introduced myself earlier, but with a name like Iyar, it doesn't hurt to say it again. So my name is Iyar, and I'm willing to bet I am the only Iyar that any of you will ever meet, because it's not only uncommon in English, it's also uncommon in Hebrew, so I have a doubly strange name. That's the language it originates in. What I think is less uncommon and more familiar is what all of us in this room share, and that's expertise as patient-centered outcomes researchers. That's what I've devoted my career to, and I think many of you in this room have done the same. And we've focused on generating that data for regulatory review to support registration. And we've made tremendous strides in that area, and we have a lot to be proud of. But the question I'm asking as part of this panel today is, are we leveraging that data sufficiently for other stakeholders? Can we go beyond registration? Do you feel like you're optimizing the PED you're collecting so that patients are getting access to the healthcare interventions that they value the most? I don't think we're doing that yet, but it doesn't mean we can't get there. But how do we start? So the first thing we need to do is understand how payers are currently thinking about patient experience data. Then we can, bridge those knowledge gaps, advocate for the value of PED in their decision-making, and find ways to more meaningfully integrate it and systematize it if we understand where things are at today. So that's how the Pfizer PCOA team has been approaching this. We have a number of initiatives in this space, and the one I'll touch on today is our partnership with AMCP, or the Academy of Managed Care Pharmacy. We worked with them to survey their members in October of last year to understand exactly that. How are they defining PED? How are they using it? Are they using it? We had a lot of questions for them as part of this survey. There are some details on the slide there, but there will be a forthcoming publication as well that provides more information about the methods and the results. We look forward to sharing that. What I do want to note is that throughout this presentation, when I talk about US payers or payers, it's the 60 people who answered this survey, right? So don't hold me to the perspective that this is all payers everywhere all the time. That said, the 60 people who were eligible for and answered the survey taught us a lot about where we're at right now. And that's the headline: US payers are not there yet. That's the key takeaway. They certainly need our guidance to understand and better integrate these data into their decision making. It's very variable, their understanding. There's a lot of perspectives there, and we need to help standardize that and bring it up to the level that it needs to get to in order to progress. And I'll show some data points that highlight how we came to that conclusion. We showed the FDA's definition of PED that Jessica and Ebony have talked about to our respondents in the survey. And most said, yeah, I agree with that. That's PED, sure. And then throughout the survey, we saw something different. They were citing sources of PED that we didn't consider PED based on the survey developers' interpretation. And even more consistently, they were telling us PED, especially PROs, can't be collected in valid, reliable, objective ways, can't be reproduced, and it's not available for me at the time of launch. Yeah, so we have a lot to say about that, I'm sure. And unsurprisingly then, when we asked them, do you find PED important to your decision-making? They didn't really, and their organizations aren't using it that much. So the bottom line here is that there's a variable and not very strong understanding of PED across this community from what we could tell, and that's the first hurdle we have to overcome. But on the other side, we also saw some encouraging trends here. There's a lot of opportunity. Most of our respondents said that they consider whether outcomes in clinical studies are ones that matter to patients. We can work with that. That's a starting point, right? We're glad to see that. And they also said that their organizations are somewhat open to PED as part of formulary decision-making. Now, that was the second response option after not at all, but at least it's something, right? I mean, we have to take what we can get. That's a foot in the door. They're somewhat open to this. And then they also told us that PED is going to be more influential in their decision-making if it's available at the time of launch and if it's a primary or key secondary endpoint. And we all know that COAs and PED are available throughout clinical development as evidence, and they often can be positioned as primary key secondary endpoints. It's already happening. So it's not just about educating on the definition of PED, it's also on how it's already part of how we demonstrate the benefit and value of healthcare interventions. I'm a qualitative researcher at heart, so these numbers are great, they say a lot, but I think the quotes from our respondents provide that richer context about how they're looking at things. I'm going to start with the quote on the top left. It says, "Long-standing policy is not to use patient-reported outcome measures as they are found to be too subjective." I want to let that sink in. That's not just one person saying, I don't like PROs, I don't trust PROs. It's our organization is not going to use this type of data. It's one response, but it's, we're up against this, right? So I think we need to be aware of that. Top right was also a quote that sparked a lot of feelings in me. "I don't think as a health plan we are at a place where we would trust any PED. We are already skeptical enough of the clinical trials. This seems like it could be even more easily manipulated." I see shock. I like this. It means I'm not alone. So yeah, I mean, I was surprised to see that. It was really sobering for me, but that's the reality, right? And for some perspectives. And so we have to be aware of that. And then lastly, this was a common theme here. We lack a standard process and data and ways to evaluate presumably PED and present to the committees. So they, even if they're interested in this, right, they don't even know how to start talking about it and using it as evidence. But we have some good stuff too. I absolutely love this quote on the top left. I think it really speaks to why we should keep doing this work and the immediate value of it. "Based on my new understanding of PED, many drugs are approved and placed on our formulary based on a clinical endpoint that is considered PED." It's already happening, right? If we educate our stakeholders, they might start to realize they're already trusting and using these data. It's less overwhelming when you realize that it's not something that you should be skeptical about. You're already using it. Another quote on the top right: "If clinical study outcomes don't appear to have a meaningful connection to the patient, we generally wouldn't value them as much." Well, we can all agree on that in this room, so that was nice to see as well. They're not talking about how they're, defining that it's meaningful to patients, but okay, that's at least they're interested in that and thinking about it as far as they're telling us. And lastly, I think this is a very compelling, forward-thinking quote. "We anticipate that we will use PED, more frequently to differentiate between agents. So as treatment landscapes become more competitive and crowded, PED should be that differentiator that says which product is going to give patients the most value based on what they want to see as benefit in their treatment." So I'll close by going back to where we started. We're not there yet. You saw the skepticism, you saw the misconceptions. There's a lot to overcome, and that's our first step. But I hope you also saw that there's openness, there's curiosity, there's room to grow here, and payers are interested in this, as Jessica said. So we have to capitalize on that now, and it's those of us in this room that should really be taking the lead because we're the experts in this space and we can guide it to go in the right direction, and we don't want to lose momentum. So we really have an opportunity here, and I saw that live at AMCP earlier this week. Our co-author presented the results to their community on Tuesday in Nashville, which feels like 10 years ago now. But that room was packed, and nobody left before the session ended, and we didn't even have time to get through all their questions. So if that's not motivating to you all, I don't know what is. It really motivated me to know that there's interest on their part. And they said as much in the survey. They want training on what PED are, how it's being used in drug development, and we're the right people to move that forward. So let's get started. We don't have anything to wait for. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Iyar. And I just want to begin by saying thank you for putting a patient perspective on this panel. I think, as I said, my name is Leah Howard. I'm the CEO of the National Psoriasis Foundation. And I'm going to bring you a little bit of the work that we've done that I hope can give you some examples of how some of this work is being put in action by the patient advocacy community. So for those that aren't familiar with the National Psoriasis Foundation or the psoriatic disease community, we are a nearly 60-year-old organization that serves the roughly 8 million people in the United States who live with psoriasis and psoriatic arthritis. And psoriatic disease is really interesting because in many ways it is an excellent case study when you think about the impact that can happen with attention and investment in a disease space that leads to progress. So over the last 20 years, we've had incredible investment in the development of new therapies for psoriasis and psoriatic arthritis. People tell me all the time, oh yes, I see the commercials about psoriasis on TV, right? You can't turn on your TV and not see a psoriasis commercial. But up until 2002, when the first of the biologics was released, our community was really living with coal tar and phototherapy as their only options. And the community was incredibly stigmatized. People lived with psoriasis covering 30, 40. I talked to a woman last night who said 90% of her body was covered in psoriasis. And it was unbelievably debilitating and life-altering. And so fast forward to the last 20 years, and we've had amazing progress. And thanks to today's advanced therapies, our community can get to clear skin and much better managed joints. However, we know that each individual's journey with psoriatic disease is unique. And what one patient responds to may not be a therapy that another patient responds to. And so it is critical that we are thinking about this community in a way that doesn't take a one-size-fits-all approach. So what I'm going to do is share with you a little bit about some of the work that we've done. And it really started with this understanding that we know that clinical trials in many cases don't represent the real life experience of patients. And as we think about what matters most to patients, it's certainly the things that we hear about from the community every day. We are constantly thinking of how we can help our patient community access these therapies and achieve the great health outcomes that these therapies have made possible. Traditional value assessment, in much the same way, tells an incomplete story. And so while you've heard here today about all of the elements of patient experience data that we'd like to see brought in, we know in many cases those are not considered. And from our perspective, if NPF and other patient organizations aren't bringing some of these experiences and perspectives forward, the question we ask is who will? And so really because of that, more than a decade ago, we started engaging Iyar and others that were having these conversations here in the US, with this goal being that if value assessment was going to play a role in dictating whether or not patients would have access to these new therapies, we at least wanted the value assessors to have a more complete picture of what it means to live with psoriatic disease and what a patient journey really looks like and what patients are really thinking about and valuing as they are working with their clinician to decide on the right therapy for them. The National Psoriasis Foundation has decades worth of data that, thanks to being 60 years old and collecting data throughout much of our history, we knew we could bring to those conversations, along with deep relationships with both the patient and the clinical community. And so back in 2015, when Iyar announced their intention to review 2 therapies in 2016 that were expected to be approved for psoriasis, I reached out to Iyar and said, we understand that you've got these 2 drugs on your list for next year, and we really think we have some information that would be valuable to you as you undertook that process. And we pushed a little bit to get a meeting and brought some clinicians and patients into that first conversation and started over the course of many conversations to help them understand why the data that they were looking at was likely incomplete. And it was really with this goal, you can see kind of an Iyar review timeline here on the screen. It was really with this goal of at each stage trying to build a more comprehensive data set for them. So from the first scoping conversation through the draft evidence report, each time we were trying to assess what were they looking at, what data did they have available, what had they brought into that stage of the process and say, here's what you're missing and here's what we can offer you. We were lucky that it just so happened at the time they were doing this review that there was also a patient-focused meeting happening at the FDA, a PFDD meeting. And so we were able to take that data and that information that we were sharing with the FDA, and we had about 200 patients that participated in that meeting in March of 2016, and so we were able to directly connect that work with the work that Iyar was doing. I think what we saw through the course of those conversations is that what was really impactful was the impact of living with psoriatic disease and thinking through the management of a psoriatic disease patients in ways that went beyond the skin. So there's obviously lots of data about how each of the therapies in our space performs with regard to clearing the skin and how much body surface area a patient is likely to clear based on each of the therapies. But there were so many more considerations that we wanted Iyar to be looking at. Things like what the young person who's headed off to college and wants to study abroad is thinking about when it comes to having a therapy that can easily travel with them around the world, or the unhoused patient that might not have access to a refrigerator to receive and store their treatment. And so really bringing in all of those considerations, in addition to continually going back to what the real life experience of a patient is managing comorbidities and other health impacts of living with psoriatic disease. And each of these conversations was really intended to return to this idea that at the end of the day, that individual patient is going to have a different set of priorities and considerations than the next patient that comes into that office. And we want to enable the clinician to be able to treat the patient standing in front of them. Fast forward a few years, we began a collaboration with the University of Pennsylvania and University of Utah to assess the safety and efficacy of home phototherapy versus office-based phototherapy. This was a really interesting project because up until the time this work was started, home phototherapy was considered investigational, and so insurers wouldn't cover it. And so what we were really looking to understand was whether a new start patient would perform as well on phototherapy at home as they did in the clinician's office. And as we began this PCORI-funded project, one of our goals was to bring the payer perspective in from the very beginning. So we designed this study to include a payer committee alongside a patient committee and a clinical committee to inform us about everything from the design of the study to ultimately the outcomes and presentation of the work to the payer audience. And I think what was really interesting about this was in doing this work with payers directly from the very beginning, we were able to address some of the questions that they had about not just this modality of treatment, but how the study was designed in such a way that at the end of the day, our goal was to make home phototherapy more accessible to patients. And the great outcome of this work was a paper published in JAMA in 2024 saying that home phototherapy is non-inferior to office-based phototherapy for all skin types. We had segmented by skin type as well. And that was really exciting because for patients who wanted to go on phototherapy, who were having to go into the clinical office setting for 8 to 12 weeks, 3 times a week, paying a copay every single time you went in and having to leave work or pay parking, get childcare, the ability to do phototherapy at home was something they very much valued. And we could see that in the data. They were more adherent to their treatment regimen, and they got better outcomes. And so it was really exciting to be able to bring that data forward. And ultimately, because we had payers engaged in this work from the very beginning, we had an easier time engaging them in conversations about changing their policies. And ultimately, we're able to get several payers to change their policies over the last year as a result of this new data coming out. So I think as we think about the lessons we've learned from both the Iyar work and the work with payers through the LIGHT study, the first thing that I would say is we continue to see that data alongside the patient perspectives and preferences was really critical to that work, being able to present a much more complete picture than what they were seeing. Obviously, we spent a lot of time thinking through with them the fact that as we brought patient experience data forward, we also had clinical experts who were reinforcing that and were able to be a partner with us, members of our medical board and clinical advisory committees who were able to give both the anecdotal information, but also references for additional publications in this area were incredibly helpful. And I think it's encouraging from our perspective to see how these studies, these experiences have led to adoption of better policies. But as I think the point Iyar made is early still. And we continue to encourage patient groups to engage in this same type of work and look forward to having more discussions with the payer community.
Thank you to our presenters. And now I want to give an opportunity for Dana to act as discussant and react to some of these from a payer perspective.
Yeah, so I'm just going to make a couple comments and then we'll go into the moderated panel discussion. But I first wanted to just explain just 30 seconds about who AMCP is, Academy Managed Care Pharmacy. We are an organization, a membership-driven organization that represents professionals that work in the managed care industry in any part of that ecosystem. So it could be life science companies, it could be payers, it could be plan sponsors, government plan sponsors, patient advocacy groups, consultants, academia. So again, we represent all of those people who consider themselves working in this managed care ecosystem. So we have focused for the past several years on really thinking about how patient voice should drive the work that we do. And our overall mission is increasing affordability and accessibility to medications for our patients. So thinking of the patient is super important to that mission, and we try to strive to do that. So as a part of our patient voice kind of initiatives and trying to make sure that it underpins everything that we do, we did just in the past year and a half, started thinking about patient experience data and how do we help prepare payers to do a better job of incorporating patient experience data into their decision making. And when I say decision making, a lot of times we think about formularies, utilization management, prior authorization, but to me it's so much bigger. It's not just that, and I say just, those are super important measures and outcomes that we want to impact. But again, it's overall how our plans thinking about using patient experience data in everything they do, whether it be program development, identifying patients for interventions, all of those kinds of aspects. So we have done we've kicked off our work in specifically patient experience data, and we did that starting off with the survey. We did a landscape survey, and we also did in-depth interviews as well. We presented the data here. We presented it at our annual meeting as well. And then in June, we're going to pull together what we call a partnership forum. One of the things that we feel like we do a really good job at AMCP is convening and creating a collaborative space where we can and bring all perspectives together, identify some goals, and move forward to help improve whatever that issue is across the market. So that partnership forum will include representatives from life science companies. We're going to have a lot of payers, health plans there, PBMs. We'll have the research community represented. We have other associations that are doing a lot of work in this area, and then patient advocacy organizations as well. It's been impressive, the work that patient advocacy organizations has done, and as it relates specifically not just to patient voice, but to patient experience data. So as we've been preparing for that partnership forum, one of the things that we've kind of identified is there are really three main buckets of barriers that exist to how health plans are positioned to operationalize patient experience data into decision making. And the first is a literacy gap. Iyar presented, 87% of people identified that they knew what patient experience data was, but then clearly they don't really understand it. And I thought what the most interesting thing was that people don't even realize they're already using it in their decision making today, right? It's already being incorporated into, and again, when we talk about patient experience data too, it covers and support so many activities. We're really kind of focusing on kind of that clinical trial outcomes, real world evidence generation. So that's kind of the area we've decided we're going to focus on now. But so we've got that literacy gap. We also now have we have a decision making gap too. So when we understand it, how we place that in our traditional algorithm or box of how we currently make decisions, that needs to evolve as well, right? Because it's not something that we have traditionally placed a high value on. And so where we put that in the decision algorithm is going to be an important step as well. And so then thinking about value, we've got this spreadsheet gap where we need to be able to incorporate clinical and economic factors together. So how do we do that as we think about patient experience data will be something else that we'll need to address. And again, help provide frameworks and support resources for payers to help implement that. So I do think we're at a tipping point, if you will. And so I am also super excited about the interest that we gained from our membership. We've been talking to our board about it as well. So there's a lot of support and desire. I think all of the things that Jessica talked about, a lot of the, what's going on in other countries and how that can influence how we position that. So again, I think there's a lot of different things that are coming about that are going to support kind of us creating this wave of action. Most importantly, though, one thing I do want to just mention as we think about the consensus of definitions, and again, man, we in managed care love some standardization. And so some of the super important work is creating consensus and getting standardization. So again, the work that the FDA has done to put guidance out to help standardize that approach is going to be super important as we continue to do that work as well. So those are just my opening comments, and then we'll Ebony, if you'll give us some questions, but only the softballs.
Only the softballs?
We'll let the audience give us the curveballs.
Well, first, our panel did a great job on this, right? We're now going to go into some moderated Q&A. We have some great landscape that was set for us. We're also going to talk about practical challenges and a positive outlook. So what can we do to make things better and to move things forward? So to begin, I'm going to start with Jessica. You did a really, really good job, by the way, of setting us up with an understanding of how the HTA archetypes differ and how everyone has a different approach to incorporating PED into their decision making. But one of the key points of we're not there yet stuck out to me. So what are opportunities for harmonization and helping to guide us on how we can best bring them along, given that we know that there are different levels of evidence, different types of evidence that are accepted across the different HTAs. How can sponsors truly deliver on this evidence, knowing that we have multiple stakeholders to appease?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that question. It's a great question, and I feel like when we think about it, we're already doing a lot of what we need to be doing when we are developing evidence to meet that regulatory hurdle. It's really more about getting this consistent understanding. So I think there's an opportunity for education before we're able to harmonize. So educating those payers on what we mean when we say PD, I think regulators are there. But I think there's a lot of opportunity for educating payers on what good looks like and what we're already doing in terms of robust evidence generation, putting our COA-based endpoints in the testing hierarchy, making sure we have high quality data with minimal missing. I think there was that kind of common thread when you think about what HTA agencies are already looking for. If we think about Germany and France, when they already have these strict standards for COA-based endpoints for their decision making, that's already what we're doing for regulatory bodies. So thinking about ways that we can educate and then package it in a way that meets the expectations of these payers, I think will hopefully resonate and minimize the burden. So we don't have to really do things differently. We just may have to adjust our strategies to really find a way to meet the needs of these different stakeholders.
The million-dollar question, though, is do sponsors have to really customize?
Yes and no. I would say that if you are designing your PD strategies and evidence generation plans through that global lens and really trying to balance the needs of regulatory and access stakeholders, there is the opportunity at the end to have some of that flexibility. If you have all of this robust evidence, flexibility in the way that you're integrating it and packaging it in your submissions. So again, one size does not fit all, but I think we have all of the tools that we need, and I think we are really, really doing an excellent job in terms of being able to meet the needs of these stakeholders. It's just how we package it, and then getting them to understand the data that they're actually reviewing to really be able to inform their decision making.
That sounds familiar. You know, we heard from regulators yesterday. You need to sort of explain what you're giving them, and so it sounds like it's similar for payers. Iyar, you did a great job too, summarizing the survey results, and it was very illuminating to us. You also gave us some candid responses. I do have a question around, you know, when you went into this survey, you had an expectation of what you were going to get. What surprised you the most? Top one surprise that you got from these survey results that really is going to change the course of how you're communicating to your internal teams on what needs to get done?
So I presented some of the surprises there. I expected that there would be issues with PROs. I didn't realize how pervasive and rampant and deeply entrenched those biases against PROs would be. I didn't present this on the slides, but we asked the respondents to rank all sorts of evidence types, PED and non-PED, and tell us which were most informative to them in their decision making. PROs, qualitative data, preference, ranked amongst the lowest. But the number one, above biomarkers, above anything else, was ClinRos. And perfos ranked really high too. So some PED, great, the best, number one. Other PED, no, we don't touch that. So that was not unexpected, but I didn't realize how deep it went. And I think that's our first area to tackle, is making it clear to other stakeholders that all COA types follow similar principles for development, for evaluation, that we take the same approach to demonstrate them as being fit for purpose, that same evidence, and when we do it that way, they should all be valued equally in decision making. And I think that's something that we need to tackle first and foremost to get this done. So it wasn't totally unexpected, but it went a lot deeper than I appreciated and was really pervasive throughout all the responses. So we know what we have to do now.
Wonderful. Yep.
I'll add, so that wasn't as surprising to me, and mostly because if you think about the professionals that are within the payer community that are making these decisions, whether it be physicians, pharmacists, other clinicians, nurses, whoever, kind of, again, not just making formulary decisions, but other program decisions, they are not trained data analysts, they're not trained scientists, they're not trained in COAs. And so that's where I feel like we as a community can kind of help bring that education to them at the appropriate level, right? They don't need to be experts in COA development, right? But again, they're not trained in that. So because they're not trained in that, that's what creates this perception that even if you think, I mean, one of the things that I think has been great that's come out of like a lot of the immunologics that have, treat psoriasis is a better understanding of how different tools that are used for patient-reported outcomes are used and how they are validated, right? So if we hadn't had, like, again, I'll just say, like, if we hadn't had a lot of the work as it relates to psoriasis as an example, I mean, it would be a lot less. There would be a lot less understanding because, again, as we have diseases that come out and that is how the outcomes are measured, there's an emerging understanding of how those are validated, but there's still a lot of work to be done.
Well, piggybacking off of that, though, how do we educate? What are the ways that we can interact or what maybe can CPATH do to help provide more educational materials? I mean, what would move the needle in your opinion?
No, and again, it's like it is collaborations like this, right? And again, I think part of it is helping create creating tools and frameworks that create a way of standardizing how plans and payers and other decision makers can be utilizing that information and how they should be doing it. Again, we don't need to make them experts, but we do need to be able to lead them. Because, again, one of the things that happens is if you don't understand something, you don't trust it either. So that's where I really feel like the trust issue comes in, is because they don't understand it. They assume that it's, squishy and, it's not validated and there hasn't been any work on how do you create an easy, again, so it's this developing an appropriate level of understanding. And again, it's partnerships like this. It's working with organizations who can help, bring that information. But it is also how can the evidence generators do their job in helping inform about what that looks like, and then it's the evidence synthesizers and users that need a better understanding too. So it needs to come from both sides, right? So a very close, tight collaboration.
Wonderful. I'm hearing an opportunity for a working group, committee, subcommittee to create templates, resources, et cetera. And we have good examples for how we've worked with regulators to create guides and things that will help. So I see an opportunity here with payers too. Leah, great job too. I'm in an affirming mood. Thinking about just education and how you had to walk access decision makers through the importance of the patient voice. Can you let us know, how did you determine what data would be most impactful for them? What was your experience in receiving direction from ICER? Can you give us some insight into that?
Yeah, I'm happy to. So, as I said, when we began our engagement with ICER, it was really a phone call, and we did that first discussion and said, let us tell you about some of the data that we've been collecting over decades. We have an annual survey with a really robust data set that is IRB approved and has been collected over many, many years that speaks to the experience of patients. But we had so many more tools than that. And so really the initial conversation was one where what we were trying to do was help them to understand that there was a lot more available than what they may be looking at in the literature. And so so kind of sampled what some of that could look like. And as I said, we had a conversation with both clinicians and patients really early on too, to help them understand a lot of the nuance. So when that first ICER review, we've actually gone through 2 ICER reviews. When that first ICER review happened, there was a thought that they would look at these treatments for both indications, psoriasis and psoriatic arthritis. And so we brought some dermatologists and rheumatologists into the conversation who were able to say these are very different diseases. And while they're connected, and we have 30% of patients with psoriasis go on to develop psoriatic arthritis, the presentation of disease is different. My thought process in choosing which therapy I'm going to use is very different based on a variety of characteristics. And so you really need to approach a review of these treatments differently. And so they pulled out the psoriatic arthritis piece and only proceeded with psoriasis in mind. But I think as you look through kind of what, I showed that timeline, what happens at each stage during an ICER review, we're always coming at it from the endpoint, which is our goal is to see value assessment not be used to limit access to therapies. I mean, that was kind of our overarching principle, is how, if we're going to engage in this, it's really with the understanding that we want patients to be able to access these amazing therapies that are now available to our community. So how do we bring forward data that's going to make this review as comprehensive as possible? And then as we saw what else was being looked at by ICER, we understood what pieces were missing and what we were going to have to go out and get. So we offered up our own data early on. We hired an economist about halfway through the exercise because we saw that there was some missing data from that perspective. When the first draft review came out and said the only drug that they were looking at that was of good value was an infused drug and none of the injectable therapies. We said, wait, something is off here. And so we're able to bring additional data at that stage. And ultimately, the outcome of that 2016 review was that all 8 of the therapies were found to be of good value, which one would think is amazing. And then we went out and started talking to payers and took the 100-plus page report to the payer community and said, we want to have a discussion about what this said. And it included things like step therapy should be abolished or limited. That's on page 92 of the report. And we would say, we want to walk through these findings with you. And many payers directly said, well, we read it differently. I'm not sure how you read some of those sentences differently, but I think it really demonstrated to us that there's continued need to engage in those conversations.
Great. Let's put a lens on a forward-looking lens. And when we're thinking about the type of evidence that's valued, we're hearing that there's some inherent bias toward certain types of evidence. There may be a misunderstanding of the breadth of evidence that could be useful. And one thing that we hear about is subjectivity, right? And there's a lack of representativeness of the data, sort of cherry picking. You only have 5 patients. That doesn't matter. We need 100 or whatever. So when we're putting on the lens of the robustness of evidence that's required by payers, how do we ensure that the patient experience data that is presented to HTA bodies, to payers, reflects that diverse voice of the patient so that they won't discount it as subjective, minimal, not robust enough? What can we do to activate that understanding on their side to know that this is a totality of evidence thing? How much evidence is enough? What can we do to move the needle so that they're not as biased against these data? I guess I'll start with Leah.
Well, I would say, it's again, coming at this conversation from our end goal of seeing patients be able to access therapies. I've heard a payer say, I'm not going to attribute it to all payers, but I've heard a payer say, if you want me to expand access to therapy, I'm going to need 2 clinical trials and all this data. If there's an opportunity for me to limit access to therapy, all I need is 1 good case study. So, I think there is that subjectivity, and I think there is the cherry picking that often happens. Our medical board spends a lot of time trying to put information out so that there is a more complete data set to kind of prevent those maybe I'll say bad actors in the moment from making those decisions with really limited data, but I do think it's a challenge.
Dana, do you have any? Oh, your mic.
Of course, it has to happen once a day, right? Usually on a Teams meeting. I think it is. It kind of does go to Jessica. It's like it's not one size fits all, right? So it is going to be dependent on the disease category and how many products. I mean, so again, there's a lot of factors that go in. So unfortunately, it's not going to be just a one size fits all. It's going to be dependent on a lot of factors. Again, I think as it relates to, again, addressing this like literacy gap, I think that helps, again. So again, even though it may be a need differently depending on, what it is you're addressing, I think tackling that literacy gap, I think, is the most important thing that we can do.
Okay. And for the final plan question, I would like everyone to respond. If you could make one recommendation to sponsors and researchers in the room about how to approach PED for value assessment and payer engagement, what would it be? I'll start with Jessica.
I'm just going to further emphasize my earlier point. When we think about designing our global PD strategies and evidence generation plans, really designing them with all of our stakeholders in mind and being thoughtful about balancing the needs of regulators and access stakeholders, because you need to be ensuring that you do have that right evidence to meet the needs of both those hurdles. And I think that ensuring that you have robust evidence to support your COAs as fit for purpose, which again, I'm preaching to the choir. So this is all things that we're already doing. But ensuring that you do have those high quality validated COAs that are fit for purpose in your target patient population, the high quality data coming out of your trials, trying to minimize missing data. And I heard Iyar from some of the survey around payers looking for those ranked endpoints. HTA bodies are looking for the exact same thing. So there are a lot of similarities there, and just making sure that our strategies are really designed with the needs of both those stakeholders in mind, I think will go a long way.
Thank you. Iyar?
I fully agree with Jessica, the high quality data point. I mean, I think we should make the t-shirts like the context of use the other years. That always should be high quality data. So if someone wants to chip in with me, we'll have that for next year. My takeaway is, as Dana was already alluding to, we're all in this together. It's not on one company, one function, one organization. We all have to work on this, and it's going to take really deep and transparent collaboration and communication on this front. So I think this panel is just a start, but it reflects the various perspectives that have to be involved, and there are others that need to be involved to move this forward.
I'll build on that and repeat my compliments to having a patient perspective in this panel. And I think as patients are engaged in these conversations as a key stakeholder, there's a fellow patient advocacy CEO that I work with who says patients shouldn't have a seat at the table, patients are the table. And I think when we think about the role that we've been able to play in some of these conversations, it's really been because we've had deep relationships with many of the other stakeholders and been able to gain that understanding of where the gaps are and where we can bring forward a more complete perspective of the patient experience. And so I think having those discussions with the patient community, with patient experts from the outset, so that those opportunities are created to build those relationships and have that stakeholder representation is key.
And I'll just continue the 100% high quality data is super important. And again, as you think about how plans are evaluating data, making those decisions, they are looking for that high quality validated data that they can use to support their decisions. They can't just make decisions without support. They have to document how they're making these decisions, what resources and references they're using. So keep that in mind. The other thing too is I would go into conversations and thoughts about the fact that we all we may come about it at a different way, but we do all have the patient, supporting the patient is our end goal. So just keeping that in mind too, and ensuring in conversations and as you're thinking about how you're approaching it, that aligning conversation around the patient is super important.
Wonderful. Excellent presentations and remarks. Key takeaways for you guys. The landscape is evolving, so keep up. Evidence quality matters. Collaboration is key, and we have work to do together. Right? Thank you all for this. So I'm switching here. I'm going to open this up for audience Q&A. Yay! So where are our microphone runners? I would ask that you keep it to one question again, not the multi-part questions. And yeah, please state your name and your affiliation when you speak. All right.
Hello. Yes. Thank you very much for the very informative, insightful panel. And Roya Sharafat from Shinogi. I think it's worth to have an honorable mention also from the value-based healthcare and value-based payment efforts, the efforts that CMMI and some of the payers had to incorporate PROs, not merely like patient satisfaction as PEDs, but PROs into the payment. And I think there have been some efforts, I don't know like where we are at this time with the changes that happened, but there has been some efforts in terms of educating the payers and providers, but also facilitating capturing of the data. So I think that would be a good kind of point of collaboration to align the efforts in terms of both, changing the paradigm and also facilitating data capture and conversations around selection of PRs, et cetera.
Thank you.
Can you comment on that, please?
So did you have a specific question to?
Yeah, I think that would be.
I'll respond for sure. So we definitely know, as history has shown us, that as CMS goes, it usually ends up leading into initiatives and things that happen in the commercial space as well. And so having those measures tied to quality payments, I think is I totally see that evolving into commercial approaches as well as we think about how ACOs can evolve, in thinking about the commercial space, not the Medicare or Medicaid space, but as it relates to commercial, like seeing all of those efforts and seeing those move into the commercial space. I think that's exactly how it will evolve, actually. So,
Wonderful.
If I may. Hi, thank you very much. Incredibly interesting and relevant discussion. And my name is Marco Rizzo. I'm with Biogen, and I'd like to pose a question sort of as a case study, and I'll make it quick. So Biogen is partnering with Stoke to develop zorevunersen for the treatment of Dravet syndrome. And it's been years in the making, and a pivotal study has been developed, and it's in progress. So the data has to be demonstrated. But here's what the sponsors are worried about. The primary analyses are seizure counts, and the critical secondary analyses are the Vineland adaptive behavior scales. Now, the seizure counts are, and these patient experience is roughly the same as caregiver. This is all caregiver experience because these patients are also disabled. They can't speak, they have no communication, they can't report anything. So the primary analysis is caregiver reported, and all of the elements of the Vineland, expressive communication, receptive communication, socialization, coping skills, and on, are all caregiver reported, and that's everything. So the sponsors are worried about that the goalposts are going to move, and I'm looking at managed care. Are the goalposts going to move? I mean, are they going to look at this severe developmental disorder and understand the unmet need, or are they going to start poking holes in, well, this is all caregiver reported data? It's a worry.
Again, I think it goes to helping close the literacy gap about the value of how taking that care. I mean, again, so as we think about PED, and I'll be a little more broad in the definition right now, but as we think about how that plays into the support for that therapy, for example. I mean, it could be a drug, it could be any kind of treatment option. I think it's important to identify what that value is and how that applies to the outcomes. The other thing we haven't really talked about, and again, one of the things that is super valuable, I think, as we think about how patient voice and how patient experience data impacts adherence. Again, not just to drugs, but it could be to any treatment, any kind of treatment approach, and the value of a caregiver and patient cooperation and collaboration as it relates to certain diseases and conditions is super important. And so I think that's evolving, and again, I think that needs to be a part of what we address as it relates to how they should be considered.
Great.
Hi, my name is Katja Rudel, and I'm a vice president from Kilo Research. Many of you know me before, but I also am a director of the board of RISPOR, and we do have this discussion all the time, and the director of Iyar is on the board as well, and it is an important consideration. And I think in the European space, we do have now the joint clinical assessment, and that's where we see the marriage of the COA FDA guidance, and that is the conceptual models and the measurement models being required in the joint clinical assessments now. That's for rare disease, but it's coming over into the more generic space over the next, I would say, 5 to 10 years. So I think, hopefully, what I'm hoping, because in Germany we do have that really rigorous assessment, and where actually patient-relevant endpoints are the main endpoints for payer considerations on whether the drugs are paid for at a good dollar price, that I'm hoping that we're going to see that pull over globally. That's my hope. But I think the idea about doing the collaboration and doing more training is definitely needed, because the main problem is that there are over 6,000 PROs, and it's very difficult if you are a reviewer, and I'm sure you know that too, to understand all of those when you don't know the therapy area. So the people then go to the EQ5D or other things. So there's education needed, which are the really good PROs and why they're good. And I would love to see more of that come also to ISPOR. So
Okay, great.
that's an invite.
Thank you. I know we had some questions over here. Yep. Nikki? Oh, okay. Yeah. So you go first.
Okay.
And then Nikki.
Great.
And
I'll
then
be quick.
Selena. We only have 3 minutes, by the way. So let's keep the question short.
Jay, Pfizer, Patient-Centered Outcomes Assessment Team. My question for the panel is that there seems to be a gap between the data that we already have in hand that's acceptable to regulators and being able to communicate that to U.S. payers. So in the short term, next year, 2 years, what can we do to better present these data? Is it updating the way that we write our GVDs, doing a better job working with our U.S. market access colleagues? What can we do right away to kind of elevate these data and make them more digestible, acceptable to our payer audiences?
Can I kick that question to Iyar to start?
Well, I was going to ask Dana about the format and how it's open for comments now, and that could be an avenue, Jay, in the short term that we can capitalize on.
So we are. So I was actually going to say that same thing too. So just for everybody here, one of the things that AMCP has done for 25 years is we've developed a guidance document that is intended to standardize how pharmaceutical manufacturers should be presenting evidence and data on their drugs, and a recommendation for how payer decision makers should be utilizing that information and kind of evaluating like what's important. And so it is open for comment right now, but we do have an intention to include information about patient experience data and how it should be used, and try to develop a framework within that guidance document. So we do already have that. We have that in the plans. So again, one of the things is one of the most valuable things that we can do as conveners and collaborators is bring the experts into the communication and discussion, and help us decide what is best, and how we can position that. So that, again, the format is open for comments right now. So it's on our main amcp.org website. On the main page, there's a link there that it says the format for formulary submission. So I would encourage everybody to go in and add some comments, and specifically around, how can we better, again, set up clear standards and guidance around how to incorporate PED.
Wonderful. So we have 59 seconds, and perhaps we can have the question, and then maybe the answer can trickle into the break. Yeah.
Hi, Nikki Bush, Open Health. I'll make this really quick. When you're speaking with payers about patient experience data and specifically patient-reported outcomes, are you using examples, or have you seen examples used? And I'm wondering if they're conflating patient-reported outcome with health-related quality of life. And I know we've gotten away from the distal proximal, but when I hear a ranking of ClinRo, then Perfo, then PRO, I'm hearing signs and symptoms, function, health-related quality of life, not necessarily poorly validated or poorly used patient-reported outcomes. And I'm just wondering if that came out at all in your research. Thanks.
Here.
Am I allowed?
Yes.
Okay. I think you're spot on, Nikki, because what we heard at AMCP is patient experience data is seen as testimonials. It's an anecdote. It's one story, whereas clinicians or ClinRos are telling us about the disease experience. So I think that's spot on in terms of that observation. But I have 10 seconds, so we're done. Or I'm over.
You're over 10 seconds. So thank you all for this engaging conversation. Thank you to the panel.